Well, we're looking at the life of David on a Sunday evening. And last time we saw David in much difficulty. He was being led by the Philistines into a battle against Israel, and only by God's intervention was he able to get out of it. He then travelled home with his men to Ziklag, but when he reached there, he found that their absence had caused trouble because a lot of bandits had come along and stolen all their possessions and taken the women and children captive and burnt their houses down. And his men were so grief-stricken about this that they started to blame David for what had happened, and they even spoke to each other about stoning him. But David was able to turn his thoughts towards God, and he encouraged himself in the Lord. He knew that God had helped him in the past and that he was able to help him now. But how was he going to do it? He knew that God had anointed him to be the next king, and so that must be something that would definitely happen. So neither his men nor anybody else could kill him before he became king. But what about his loved ones? There was no promise concerning them. So there was no certainty of ever seeing them alive again. And what about his men? For surely he didn't want his men to be suffering like this. He later wrote in the Psalms of how the Lord had delivered him out of his many troubles. And this was one of those troubles. He quickly realizes that the thing to do was to seek the Lord and to ask him for directions as to what, if anything, he should do in order to get his people and possessions back again. At least he could try and go after the bandits, for who knows, some of his people might still be alive, and if they were not, he could punish the bandits for what they'd done against him. It was a great benefit that David had a priest with him in verse 7. He was called Abiathar, and he was the only survivor of Saul's massacre of the priests of Nob. It was a pity that David hadn't consulted the priest before this. It may have spared him a lot of trouble that he had now. But no more would David seek to solve his problems by himself. That's how he got himself into this mess. When he'd felt that Saul would kill him, he left Israel and gone to live amongst the Philistines to save himself. A very stupid thing to do. But now he'd repented of that sin and disobedience and had encouraged himself in the Lord. And so we begin to see the spiritual fruit of this as he now seeks the Lord for guidance. He's now committing his way unto the Lord, knowing that he will bring it to pass. And so we can say that the Christian who is walking with God will commit the affairs of their lives into God's hands and will not make decisions, especially big decisions, without consulting him and taking his leading. But with a Christian who is backslidden, they might still be praying, but they will, by and large, make their own decisions without the leading of the Lord, depending on what they feel is going to be best for their earthly circumstances. Anyway, David asked Abiathar, the priest, to bring his ephod with him, for this was the breastplate of judgment belonging to each priest, which contained the Urim and Thummim, and which was used to find out the mind of God on important matters. And in this way, David inquires of the Lord and asks him, should he try and pursue after the bandits? And if he did, would he be able to catch them up? And the Lord's answer to this was even better than he'd asked for. For David is told that he should go after the bandits and that he would catch them up. And even better than that, he's promised that without fail he would recover all that he'd lost. So in a moment of time, David's sorrow turned to joy. He was still amongst the ruins of Ziklag. His loved ones at best were in the hands of the bandits, but he got God's promise, and his faith in that promise brought him joy. And no doubt this made his men change their attitude, and they respected him again. And so in verse 9, they all set off. They were already very tired because they travelled for 3 days on their way back to Ziklag. And now they were travelling again without much of a rest. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. And David had waited on the Lord, and having spent time with God, he was more fit to work for God. But it was inevitable that some of his men would not be able to keep going. And sure enough, after a time, a third of them, 200, just couldn't go on. So David had to leave them behind at the brook called Bezor, which was no doubt a trial to his faith. It was rather like when Gideon had his men whittled down so that he would depend more upon God. It's very hard to believe in God's promises when things seem to be getting worse instead of getting better. At times it will seem that you've got just nothing but the promise. Everything else is crying out that it won't happen. And there's nothing like your fellow labourers pulling out to make you discouraged. You can say to yourself, well, if they're not going to do their part, I'm not going to do mine. And you can even get so low as to say, well, if God is not going to do his part, I'm not going to do mine. If God is not bothered about the situation, why should I be? But of course, that's the voice of the devil. David may well have thought that it was odd that God had given him this promise and then allowed a third part of his men to drop out. But David doesn't make these men go with him. He either felt that they just couldn't take it anymore, or he felt that it was no good forcing people to do things against their will. And the son of David acts in the same way with his followers. He doesn't force them to do Christian service. Anyway, David rides on with his 400 men, and it was not long before they came across a young man who was half dead in verse 11. This was in the plan of God, for David didn't know where the bandits had gone or how far in front of him they were. And although nobody realized it at the time, this young man was actually put there by God so as to be a guide for them. He would have been the last person you would have expected that God would use, for he was an Egyptian slave. He belonged to one of the Amalekite bandits. But when he became sick, he was thrown out by them. And this had happened 3 days prior to this, so that by now he's not only sick, but he's famished, he's near starvation. And that's how sometimes the world treats its people. It gets all it can out of a person, and then when they can no longer do anything more, they're thrown out or put to one side. Sometimes happens in marriages, ungodly marriages, where a person gets the best they can out of their partner for several years, and then they're not getting the same out of them, so they just dump them. The Amalekites should have placed this sick slave into one of their carts and to be carried along, or at least give him enough food. If they're going to throw him out, give him enough food to keep him going. We shall see later how they had an awful lot of food, these people, so why didn't they give him some? But he was just left there out in the wilderness to perish. However, the Amalekites would rue the day when they'd done this to this young slave, because they're going to lose their lives because of it. We find later on in verse 16 that there was plenty of food available. They were all having a great banquet by the time David reached them. However, the bad treatment which this slave had endured eventually led to his life being spared. And it shows once more that God had chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. And so David feeds this Egyptian lad. Indeed, he was not only given bread and water, but also figs and raisins. But as he'd been 3 days and 3 nights without food and drink, he was really in a bad way. But eventually he comes to, and his spirit's revived. And David began to ask him questions. Who do you belong to? And where have you come from? And the young man explains that he was from the Amalekite people. They'd attacked various towns, including Ziklag, he says. So David immediately knew that he belonged to those bandits that he was seeking for. And he asked the young man, could he lead them to where the Amalekites were now? And the young man said that he could do this, but he wanted David to make him a promise in God's name that he would spare his life before he showed him where the bandits were. David must also promise that he would not give him back to his master, for that would be as bad as dying, because his master was so evil. And so this lad was prepared to place his life on a promise made in the name of God. Perhaps God had been working in his life for some time now, so that despite his bad start in life, he would eventually join the people of God. You'll notice, therefore, that the bad treatment which he received was for his ultimate good. If he hadn't been sick, he would have eventually died with all the other people who David was going to attack. Is it not possible then that affliction which comes to a Christian today will work out for their ultimate good? Notice also that it wasn't David who found this chap, it was some of his men who may well have killed him, thinking that he'd taken part in the burning of Ziklag. So it was God who twice spared his life and made him useful to David. So in these verses 11 to 15, we have portrayed the salvation of Christ to a lost sinner. Indeed, there are about 10 things that are pictured here, 10. Firstly, that he was an Egyptian. And the Egyptian in the Bible pictures somebody who's in bondage in the world, as the Israelites have been in bondage in Egypt. Secondly, the Egyptian was sick, spiritually sick. Lost sinners are spiritually sick, and their disease is sin, and this leads to death. As disease robs the body of health and joy, so sin robs the soul of health and joy. Thirdly, the Egyptian was starving, and people without Christ are starving spiritually. They have no hunger and thirst after righteousness. Fourthly, the Egyptian was a slave. He was used by his master and then later thrown on one side. So the devil uses people to do bad things, and when they're in a mess, he abandons them to their fate. When Satan had used Judas in his great crime, he then left him desolate and he committed suicide. Judas had got nothing for serving the devil. He was a fool and became Satan's slave. Then fifthly, the Egyptian was saved by coming to David. And likewise, sinners are saved by coming to Christ. But the sick man was too weak to come to David on his own. And even if he had been strong enough, he wouldn't have come through fear. So today, those who are lost in sin cannot come to Christ by themselves. They need the hand of God upon them. And sometimes they also need one of Christ's followers to lead them in the right way, as David's men had brought this lad to their master. Sixthly, the Egyptian was half dead and in a desperate state. He had nothing to commend him to David, and yet the Lord's anointed had compassion on him. And so it is when sinners come to Christ, there's nothing in them for him to love, but he has compassion on them. And just like the Egyptian had his needs met, so the person who comes to Christ has their needs met. Seventhly, the Egyptian admitted that he was partly responsible for the burning of Ziklag. You notice that at the end of verse 14, he says, we burned Ziklag with fire. And the sinner must admit that their past life was one of doing evil against the person that they're now seeking help from. But eighthly, the Egyptian was asked by David to help him, and those who come to the Saviour must be prepared to help him. Ninthly, the Egyptian was given a guarantee that he would never be given back to his old master, and likewise those who come to Christ, a guarantee that they won't be given back to the devil. And lastly, whereas the Amalekites were later slain, this Egyptian was not slain. And so it will be on the day of judgment that those who come to Christ will be spared the wrath of God when it falls upon the wicked round about them. So David and his men were guided by the Egyptian slave to where the Amalekites now were, and were told in verse 16 that when they reached there, the Amalekites were having some sort of big feast. We might even call it an orgy. It says they were eating and drinking and dancing, and they were lying all over the place because of all their great spoil that they'd taken from other people. And just like the Egyptian slave is a picture of somebody being converted to Christ, so the Amalekites are a picture of people in this world who are bent on a life of pleasure. But the thing was that death was very near to these pleasure seekers. They didn't realize it. They were dancing for joy because they were unaware that this was the last hour of their life. And many people today are in the same situation. Most people have a high standard of living, but they don't spare a thought for God, and they have no interest in their own soul. All they want is pleasure, and soon and suddenly judgment will fall upon them. We're often told that the people on board the Titanic were eating and drinking and dancing and having a wonderful time when suddenly disaster struck them. The Amalekites probably thought that David was many miles away, probably fighting with the Philistines in a battle, and therefore they were totally undefended, not expecting any attack. Indeed, it says they were spread abroad upon the earth. In other words, they were not at all grouped together. They were all over the place, and therefore they would be easy pickings for David's men. Many people today live as though they're going to be in this world forever and assume that their life will go on the same way as it's always done, and that death is a long time away, and they don't need to be concerned at all about life after death. And so we're told in verse 17 that David and his men attacked the Amalekites. Indeed, it says they smote them from the twilight of that day until the evening of the next day. So that's not far short of 24 hours. What a solemn warning this is to people today who live for pleasure and give themselves over to nothing but the lust of the flesh, and who are completely unprepared for the judgment to come. What must the Egyptian slave have felt when he saw his previous companions falling by the sword? How glad he must have been that he had fallen sick. Oh, he was so pleased now that he'd fallen sick and been separated from the others. God's judgment fell on Belshazzar when he was eating and drinking at a big feast, and it fell upon those who made the golden calf when they were dancing around it, and many others have been cut off when they were in the midst of jollifications. The triumphing of the wicked is short. We're told that only 400 of the Amalekites got away, and that these were young men on camels. We're not told how many people were slain. It must have been a very large number because of the way it's worded at the end of verse 17. For it says, there escaped not a man save the 400, as if the 400 was only a small fraction of the whole total. Could be thousands of them. The good news was that David and his men found all their loved ones still alive and unhurt. There was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters. They recovered all their possessions as well, just as God had said would happen. But not only that, they obtained a great deal more besides that had not been theirs in the first place. So God had done for them exceeding abundantly above all that they asked for or even thought possible. They finished up better off than ever, as the Lord turned what was bad into that which was good. It proves once more that those whose trust is in God have very little to fear, and things don't turn out as bad as their worries suggest. How very different things were for David now, since he'd repented of his backsliding and he turned back to the Lord with his whole heart. We're specifically told that he was able to rescue his own 2 wives. They hadn't been slain, they hadn't been badly treated in any way, and that was a great wonder, and it was down to the grace of God. It was not what David deserved. And I think it would be true to say that most Christians would be happy to admit that not only has God been much kinder to them than they deserved, but there were times when they did wrong and deserved to lose out because of it. And they couldn't have complained if it had. But God protected them and their loved ones and their possessions. The fact is that God is constantly preserving his people in this world. All sorts of accidents and troubles could befall them if he wasn't doing so. Now, when David had collected all the spoil, he and his men travelled back to the brook Bezor, where the other 200 men were waiting, who'd been too fatigued to go on. They must have been thrilled to see David return victorious and to see their wives and children again. And David saluted them, wishing them all well and assuring them that he didn't regard them as having let him down. Well, that should have been a time of rejoicing and giving thanks to the Lord. But alas, the devil got in and made them fall out with each other. Great victory, and now they're falling out with each other. For amongst the 400 men who'd fought with David, there were some with evil hearts, men described in verse 22 as wicked men of Belial, in other words, servants of the devil. These men said that as the other 200 men had not fought, so it was only fair that they shouldn't get any of the spoil. Surely they can't expect it. They've done nothing for it. Anybody could say they're too tired to fight. We could have said the same ourselves. But no, we went to war and we risked our lives, so we deserve more than they do. Well, lots of people have that attitude, and you understand it to some point. Few people like scroungers. But what about those men and women who are generally not able to do their part? What about the Christian who has to carry a big affliction for many years? Surely God would want us to make allowances for them. These wicked men probably thought that by denying the 200 any portion of the spoil, they would get more. They'd get a larger portion. So maybe greed was at the bottom of it. Judas was annoyed that Mary poured that precious ointment over Christ. He said it was a waste of money, but really it was because he had the bag and he wanted the money for himself. Not long before this, these wicked men would have been glad to get half their own possessions back, let alone anything else. But now they got it all back, and much beside, they begrudged their brethren. There is that horrid sin which Satan sometimes injects into a Christian's heart, where they begrudge what another Christian has got. They may not necessarily want it themselves, but they don't feel that the other person deserves it. It appears from the words of these men that they didn't intend giving their brethren even their own possessions back. They would only be given their wives and children. In the Sermon on the Mount, our Lord tells us about the royal law, which is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this should have been exercised here, for surely the Christ-like thing to do is to try and share things out. As it says in the Epistle of Timothy, Christians should be ready to distribute and be willing to communicate. Anyway, David dislikes what he hears, and in verse 23 he gives his verdict. The 200 men who stayed behind would not be done out of their share. To begin with, he says, it was the Lord who'd given them all this stuff. Therefore, they were only stewards of it. So they must not look upon it as though they deserve more than their brethren. It all belonged to God. And those Christians who have most of this world's goods should always recognize the fact that this is the Lord's doing and not theirs. And we have God to thank for every gift and every blessing we possess. And then says David, not only has the Lord given us all this spoil, he's also preserved us and given us the victory. How kind the Lord has been to us in giving us back our loved ones and our families. Let's not be unkind to others at this point. This is ridiculous. This is sad. It's of the Lord's mercies that we're not consumed. Indeed, we could have easily been consumed. So let us be merciful to others. These men should also have remembered that their 200 colleagues had fought in many previous battles and had done their part for the whole course of David on those occasions. It's only now they couldn't go on. They were not normally like this. And it's not that the 200 men were completely useless, because they abode by the stuff. In other words, they looked after what little was left, so the 400 men were not encumbered when they did the fighting. And so it was only fair that these men received the same share as those who did the fighting. So that's what took place. It was all shared out evenly, and forever afterwards it became a law in Israel that those who tarried by the stuff would get the same as those who went down to battle. Now, when David got back to Ziklag in verse 26, he decides to be generous with a lot of the spoil that he received through his victory over the Amalekites, and he sent some of it to the elders of Judah and to many of his friends in various towns throughout Judah. David still had a lot of friends and supporters back in his own country, and he felt that he wanted to reward them. Having seen all these blessings had come from the Lord, he felt he wanted to distribute them to some of his friends. And a large number of towns are mentioned here where he sent gifts to people. But it's interesting that the first town is the town of Bethel, because the name Bethel means the house of God. So perhaps there's a pointer here to suggest that the house of God should come first regarding our giving. But perhaps the last line of the chapter tells us why he sent all these gifts to people. It was to all the places where he and his men were wont to haunt. In other words, it was to the people who'd helped them in the past when as outlaws they had to go from one place to another. So when David and his men had been in tight situations, there were various kinds of friends who came to them with food and so on, so as to help them in their hour of need. And David hadn't forgotten that, and David hadn't forgotten them. And now that he has a lot, it was to those same people that he sent gifts. It was his way of saying thank you for all their past help. And so we end on an important truth, that those who helped the son of David in his time of rejection now will eventually be rewarded by him when he comes again victorious over the devil. This whole chapter is spoken out loud and clear that when Christians backslide and go out of God's will, they must expect to lose out. But if they come back to the Lord wholeheartedly, he will not only recover all their losses, but he will add even more blessings unto them. So may God keep us from falling and graciously continue to protect us and our loved ones, whatever the future may bring. Amen.